Good morning. Welcome to Radiant Life. This is lesson 12, Solomon's Apostasy. Today we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 11. Let me start with this prayer. Father, thank you for today. Thank you that we have the benefit of your word. Help us to yield to your spirit. Give us wisdom. Show us what you would like us to hear today. May us intend for the result of this so we can obey you and follow you closer and learn and love you more. Jesus, I ask this in your name. Amen. Today, their central truth is about us guarding our hearts against the evil and remain obedient to God. Introduction, and throughout this unit, we've been reminded that serving God isn't about wise action here and a good work there. It's one who perseveres in wisdom and in obedience without ending, without, to the end is when there's eternity, there is no end. It's hard to imagine why or how somebody might turn away or betray those that they love most. Yet today we read of a strong warning that it can happen to the most wise person. Except for David, Solomon was the greatest of all kings of Israel. God blessed him with prosperity and success and gave him great wisdom beyond what any other person has known. Yet later in his life, he turned away from that wisdom, leaving a life of obedience to follow sin. This lesson explores Solomon's tragic years and serves as admonition to us. Sin is subtle. It can lead you just a little off the path, and then the further go, you, I guess, can be blind to how far you are. I'm going to start reading in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, and then verses 41 through 43. This is out of the King James. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and Zidonians, and the Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, and Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemoah, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. And the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared to him twice. And he commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which the Lord had commanded. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding, in these days I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. Verse 41, and the rest of the acts of Solomon, and all that he did in his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead. Good morning, Vicki. All right. In part one, we're looking at verses 1 through 8. God blessed Solomon with unparalleled wisdom and immeasurable wealth. Although Solomon faithfully served God in his early reign, he changed course dramatically later in life. From their beginnings as a nation, God had commanded the Israelites not to intermarry with heathen nations because of the spiritual influence they would wield. Although Solomon knew what the law commanded, he ignored the warnings and turned his affections toward foreign wives and their gods. Tragically, Solomon accommodated his pagan wives by building places of worship for their gods. So far worse than just abandoning God in his heart, he pretty much showed all of Israel that he had abandoned God by building all these idols so that his wives would worship. The true tragedy Solomon did was that he did evil in God's sight. He refused to follow God completely as his father David had done. Although we may have no intention of ever practicing idolatry, we can learn from the tragic and subtle compromise that he made up until the point of building the temple, of unhealthy relationships. Building connections with unbelievers is a major component of evangelism. However, we must be careful not to allow them to influence our beliefs, our attitudes, and our actions. This is especially true as it relates to choosing a spouse. A Christian marriage provides us with a supporting partner to help us serve Christ, but an unbelieving spouse may try to discourage us from serving God. A couple of discussion questions. First one is, why should we be intentional when building relationships with unbelievers? I can think of one instance, actually regarding somebody that I used to work with many years ago. You can spend time with them, but you have to remind yourself always to be on guard. In this instance, he was trustworthy with a lot, but he would, I'd say, steal. He would rob you of some things. But if you went into that work environment with him and you had that on your mind, you still have that great relationship with him, but you are on guard. Same thing with unbelievers. We go in knowing that we love them, we spend time with them, but we always guard our heart, knowing that our purpose, our sole purpose, is to see them come to Christ. Anybody? Okay. Exactly. Yeah. So not my end goal is to bring them to Christ, but yeah, you're right. So the whole purpose of that relationship is hmm, just planting the seed. Okay. Yeah. Believers. Here's another one. Believers often have close relationships with unbelievers. Believers, whether family members or spouses. How can they maintain such relationships without compromising their faith? And how can other Christians help them? I'm sorry? Oh. Um, hmm, mhm. Yeah, I know a man whose family were they all it was difficult because they all believed they were Christians, just because they grew up going to a church. Um, so the time he spent with his family was it was difficult. You know, it's hard to. He said it was hard to speak to them to be a witness to them when they would get upset because why are you witnessing to us? You know, why are you trying to share gospel with us? We already know it. Um, but how can Christians help them? I believe gathering every, at least on Sunday, if not more times during the week, um, to be edified and supported and admonished if something is changing to the opposite. Um, One thing that came into my mind as I was reading this week is, you know, God, when he spoke to Solomon, he says, you've turned away from me, unlike your father David. And we look at what we see as far as the actions of Solomon, but then we also see the actions of David, of all that he did. And yet God says he was a man after his own heart. So obviously, when the Bible says, we look on the actions or the outer and God looks on the heart, um, the biggest contrast I can think of was David and his son Solomon. Uh, in this section, the Lord was angry with Solomon, verses 19 through 13, or 9 through 13. Often we see two extremes in the world when it comes to understanding God. Some see him only as a God who blesses and loves. Others see him only as God who judges and punishes. Solomon's life reminds us that God perfectly balances both love and judgment. 1 Kings 11, verse 9, God once honored Solomon for choosing wisdom over pleasure and power. As a result, God gave him not only the wisdom he asked for, but he gave him immeasurable wealth. Um, Solomon turned from God to worship idols, the very opposite of wisdom. So when we think of the wisest man that ever was around on the earth, um, that he could do this. Makes me think that, if you've ever known somebody, a believer who is very knowledgeable, very wise, very discerning, remember, even that person could fall into deception and fall away. God spoke to Solomon about his sin, but Solomon didn't listen to him. Clearly, the king's heart had tragically become hardened against the God who had so blessed him. Solomon would experience harsh consequences for his disobedience. The nation God had so wonderfully blessed would be torn away from the king and given to a servant, referred to Jeroboam. Mercifully, for the sake of David's legacy, God kept one tribe, Judah, and the chosen city of Jerusalem that would be retained by his family. King Solomon had been blessed by God with extraordinary wisdom, the very thing we think would protect you from falling away or from sin. And yet we see that he finished his reign as a rebellious son. Now these two questions, this first one, I can't think of a good reason, but it asks, what are some reasons a strong believer might turn from God? One, a huge,
like lost someone they love, or lost all their money, or had a health problem.
yeah. Yep. I was going to say, might when one maybe get to a point where they're trying to impose what they think God should do on God. Here's a question that came to mind. Have you ever known a Christian blessed with great wisdom and discernment who later became hostile, or not hostile, boastful and arrogant? Where this wisdom God had apparently given them, they now took as their own, as a badge. And there's one just to ponder. And ask yourself, how would you respond if you saw a friend or a loved one turning from God toward a life of sin? I know a lot of people say, well, I would definitely be praying for them. But do you think you could be like Paul, who would admonish what he saw? And depending on the family member, some people find it really difficult to speak to parents or siblings even. But, come to part 2, where God brings adversity. It brings an enemy from Egypt. For most of us, adversity is simply a part of life. Thankfully, as believers, we trust God to bring us through. And many of us, at least in America, are dealing with adversity is disdain, insults. The rest of the world is much, much worse. In Solomon's case, adversity came from God himself as a result of Solomon's rebellion. We can only imagine Solomon's thoughts as we go through the rest of this chapter. His dilemma is a reminder and a warning to us that it is imperative that we stay faithful in following the Lord. Because of Solomon's apostasy, basically abandoning his faith, God brought twofold adversity to this fallen king. The first was his first adversary was aptly named Hadad, which means the thunderer. This was a common royal name among the Edomites, and more significantly, a common adjective describing divinity. The message was clear. The thunderer may have come from Egypt. The Lord raised him up. The event described in verse 15 through 25, which I'll read now, may well refer to 2 Samuel. David won a tremendous victory against Edom. It says verse 14 is especially significant. Let me read that. 15 through 25. I'll start with 14. And the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon. Hadad the Edomite was king of this. He was of the king's seed in Edom. For it came to pass when David was in Edom and Joab Sorry, I lost my place there. It came to pass when David was in Edom, and Joab, the captain of the host, was gone up to bury the slain, after he had smitten every male in Edom. For 6 months did Joab remain there with Israel, till he had cut off every male in Edom. Hadad fled, and he and certain Edomites of his father's servants went with him to go into Egypt, Hadad being yet a child. And they rose out of Midian and came to Paran, and they took men with them out of Paran, and they came to Egypt unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, which gave him a house and appointed him victuals and gave him land. And Hadad found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him to wife the sister of his own wife. And the sister of Taphaneus bare him Genubath, his son, whom Taphaneus weaned in Pharaoh's house, and Genubath was in Pharaoh's household among the sons of Pharaoh. And when Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab the captain of the host was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, let me depart, that I may go to my own country. And then Pharaoh said to him, what hast thou lacked with me, that behold, thou seekest to go to thine own country? And he answered, nothing, howbeit, let me go anyway. And God stirred him up another adversary, Rezin, the son of Eliada, which fled from his lord Hadadezer, king of Jobah. And he gathered men unto him, and he became captain over a band, and David slew them of Zobah. And they went to Damascus, and dwelled therein, and reigned in Damascus. And he was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, beside the mischief that Hadad did. And he abhorred Israel, and reigned over Syria. Once he learned that both men who had defeated him, David and Joab, Hadad chose to leave Egypt and return. He proceeded to cause great trouble for Solomon as a guerrilla fighter rather than a king, just as God had said. Solomon's troubles didn't end with Hadad. We find yet another persistent adversary who would plague Solomon for a long time. He had an experienced defeat in the hands of David. Another reminder that the victory God's people experienced over their enemies was a result of God's gracious hand. The Old Testament only mentions the 1 Kings 11:23-25 includes the Old Testament's only mention of the name of Razin. Yet many scholars see this as a reference to 2 Samuel 10 and believe that Razin refused to submit to Hadadezer, and later King David. As a result, he later established the kingdom of Aram Damascus, sometimes translated Syria, a kingdom that became a severe thorn in the flesh of God's people. We also see once again that these sources of adversary arose from David's victories. The kings allied with Hadadezer, surrendered and subjected themselves to Israel as a result of David's overwhelming victory due to God's intervention. But those same sources previously defeated foes. Solomon would experience adversity because of his stubborn rebellion against God. We can learn from Solomon's rebellion that we must not take God's blessings or indeed his presence for granted. He calls us to more than religious practices, as good as they might be. This can be a source of temptation for us to conclude that God will continue to bless us if we go to church, give to ministry, missions, participate in worship services, and invite our neighbors to church. I brought to mind a line from a song from the Newsboys, We Believe. Simply says, may our faith be more than anthems, greater than the songs we sing. At its foundation, our walk with God is based on commitment to him and obedience to his righteous command. Any sacrifice we choose to make is secondary to living as his child and accepting him as Lord. A couple of discussion questions. I'll read them both. What are some ways other people might be hurt by our sin? And how can we avoid the trap of taking God for granted and assuming he is pleased with us because of the religious things we do? Part 3, consequences of disobedience. 1 Kings 11:26 through 39 is our reference. Can you think of an example where one person's mistake, miscalculation, or sin caused disaster for countless other people? Well, this is certainly the case for Israel, since Solomon's rebellion led to a catastrophe for the kingdom. In verses 26 through 28, we meet Jeroboam, a capable and ambitious official of Solomon's court. Since he was from the line of Ephraim, he could appropriately serve as the overseer of a group from the descendants of Joseph as they made repairs. Verses 29 and 30 remind us that what seems like an ordinary day can have profound significance within the plans of God. As Jeroboam left Jerusalem, he was met by a prophet named Ahijah. The prophet wore a new cloak, which he proceeded to tear into 12 pieces. Handing 10 of the pieces to Jeroboam, he explained it was the will of the Lord that the nation be divided. In 1 Kings 11:32, Judah would be preserved for David's lineage, while 10 would break away, of course. That makes 11, not 12. So what's the other? However, the prophecy encompasses both historic and contemporary realities. Historically, there were 12 tribes. But over time, Benjamin became absorbed by Judah, a reality made clear in 1 Kings 12:21 to 23. What we see with this prophecy is Ahijah is a splitting of the northern tribes away from Judah, leaving Judah to exist alone and often with animosity against the northern kingdom. The Lord decreed that the southern kingdom would have only one tribe, ruled first by Solomon's son, Rehoboam, in order that it would shine like a lamp in Jerusalem. The city I have chosen as a place for my name. God's plan would not be derailed by one rebellious king. The prophet also stated that the Lord would bless the northern kingdom only of Jeroboam, and the people followed his ways and obeyed his commands. The northern kingdom did no such thing and was hurling toward blatant rebellion. Yet the gleaming promise of hope for God's people remained, and the Lord declared through the prophet, because of Solomon's sin, I will punish the descendants of David, though not forever. So a couple questions to consider. How do God's promises shine like a lamp in the sin-darkened world? And what are some ways we can keep God's promises in view even during challenging times? This section entitled Tragic Road begins with rebellion. Disobedience leads to very unpleasant consequences. In the case of Solomon, years of rebellion against God created problems that endured long after his death. 1 Kings 11 and 40 through 43 provide the sad foreshadowing of what was to come. Clearly, Solomon learned of Ahijah's prophecy and sought to kill Jeroboam. This drove Jeroboam to flee into Egypt, where he found refuge with King Shishak. This relationship itself brought trouble for God's people, and Shishak became Jeroboam's ally and later attacked Jerusalem. After a 40-year reign that began with a measurable promise but ended tragically, Solomon died and was buried in Jerusalem. Conditions did not improve when his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne. The new king followed bad advice, worsening the animosity between the northern and southern kingdoms and leading to rebellion that divided. Furthermore, details 21 through 24 in chapter 14 detail the idolatry and pagan practices that went on during his reign, summarizing that it was even worse than the sin of their ancestors. So what is God saying to us? The sad story of Kings, 1 Kings 11, includes at least 4 instances where God said he withheld specific punishments for the sake of his servant David. What a marvelous reminder that even when sin seems to pervade the world all around us, God's promises of restoration and glorious future remain true for all those who seek him. So, in concluding here, just one section, living it out ministry in action. If you know someone who struggles with regret over past sin, encourage and pray with them. Remind them that God restores and that you see their value in his eyes. That you see their value in his eyes. Take time for personal examination and reflection. Ask God to reveal any of areas of your life where you need to repent and re-surrender to Him. Spend time in prayer and praise, thanking the Lord for His incredible faithfulness and enduring promises. Some scriptures, if you want to, through the week. We have Monday, looking at the consequences for Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. Tuesday, consequences for Saul. That's in 1 Samuel 13. Wednesday, consequences for God's people in Isaiah 3. Thursday is consequences for Judas in Matthew 27. Friday, consequences for Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. And Saturday, consequences for the evil one in Revelation 20. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the reminder that you are sovereign and that we should worship and follow you in all that you command. Thank you for your mercies. Thank you for your promises. Please touch every heart today that seeks you. Touch every heart that's being led from you. For those that have left and feel that they can never come back, remind them, Father, that your mercy is forever. And I pray that you touch their heart, give them wisdom to know your mercy is forever, and you always receive them as you did as you told us in the parable of the prodigal son. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for your spirit to help us learn and guide us. Father, may you bring each of these passages this week to caution us and admonish us when we turn from what we know to follow what we choose. Help us reject any enticements to lead us astray. Let us surrender to you every day. May always give you our heart completely, Christ. And remind us as we go into the world where we are to bring you to them, not to go in with them. Jesus, I ask this in your name. Amen.